Well, hello and welcome to the Real Zero podcast. I'm not joined by my co-host today, Dan, because he's busy with family matters. So it's just me. But I'm very pleased to welcome a friend and colleague and real expert in his domain, Paul. So as is traditional, Paul, rather than me introducing you, why don't you say who you are, what your job is, and why we should believe a word you have to say about our
That's right. Yeah, good question. So I'm Paul Behrens. I'm working at the University of Oxford. I'm British Academy Global Professor, and I work on food system transformations. But my early years I spent in physics, in atmospheric physics, and I've moved more and more towards, I would say, the social sciences as I've realized that's where a lot of our problems are in actually getting the action we need for climate change. And I wrote a popular science book on climate change called The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Change. Very, very long title, but it takes paired chapters of pessimism and hope. So I really look across the whole spectrum of climate impacts and look at where are we going for food, energy, climate, demographics, and what's the best we could hope for by using the science available.
Okay, well, that brings me on to the other first question we always ask everyone. What's the best we can hope for? Let's be scientific about this. We're all going to hope for everything being perfect. But how long is it, do you think, before we see major impacts of climate change on society? And second question as comes out, how long without immediate action at pace and scale do you think before civilization really crumbles?
So I think like a lot of other people probably that you've spoken to, that we already see some of the dynamics of societal pressure already across the world. And you only need to look as far as lower middle income countries to see how deep that pressure goes. If you look at Syria, for example, if we look at Central American countries, which have seen a lot of migration due to pressures on food supplies and water supplies. So we're already in the world of that. And for people like you and me, we may not feel that as acutely as those people, but it sure as hell can for everybody. And I think the biggest dynamic that I see happening on a global scale, so you can sort of take the extreme weather events and you can see the sort of one-off events here and the one-off events there, and you can sort of imagine the flooding and the droughts and people around the world being impacted by the specific extreme events. But in terms of the really big global trends that are going to happen, I think one of the biggest pathways for that is inflation of prices. And so whenever you see the inflation of prices, especially in food prices, you see political decay. So you see in low-income countries, for example, in the 2008 food crisis, we saw riots and political upheaval across much of the world due to the spike in the food prices. And it's that grind that goes on. Research suggests that we should be expecting about 1% to 3% extra inflation on food prices by 2030.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've touched on this, I think, perhaps once or twice before. The Kazakh grain crop collapse in 2010 with that heat wave led to this massive spike in food prices. And then the countries where they couldn't offer the price, they saw the Arab Spring. Now, there are many reasons for political dissent to be there. But the thing that tipped everyone over to the edge was that. And you mentioned Syria, which, of course, for the benefit of our listeners, was an issue to do with crop failures, poverty, and inward migration from the countryside into Aleppo and the major cities that led to the destabilization that then triggered the civil war. So let's pick up on that then. So my role in this party is that I'm a nutty, that there are things I just don't know a lot about. So can you explain to me food? We've all got to eat it, right? As a doctor, I know that. 30 odd days of not eating any food, you're most likely to be dead. And there are around 8 billion of us on the planet that need to be fed. Now, if I was a subsistence farmer, presuming I just have my patch of land and I grow some veg and my food, and I might keep a cow or a goat and I'm good for food. And I might have a communal system where we store it and share it. But I don't do that. I live in a flat in London and I go to my local corner shop to get my food. Or you might go to a supermarket. So how does this work globally? Can you describe to me food supply and how it meets demand on a global basis?
Yeah, you've already highlighted that it's very different where you are in the world. Very, very different. And these supply chains are incredibly complex for people in high-income countries like the UK, where we're sitting in now, but also other countries like the US, Australia. So what typically happens is we've got a sort of the full footprint of our food consumption actually happens all over the world when you think about UK, for example. So roughly you've got the UK, and we use around 75-80% of our land to produce food, and we use almost the same again overseas to supply food. Now, where that's coming from depends on the product you're talking about. Now, of course, with the major grains, we're thinking about wheat, maize, soy, rice. These come from major bread baskets. And so we've got a system which are, and these major bread baskets, they sit in the plains of America, for example. There's some that go up towards Canada.
Right.
There's major bread baskets in Russia, in Ukraine, prior to the war. There are bread baskets in China, for example. But, these crops are incredibly concentrated across these major bread baskets.
Let's store that, because I'm going to come back to that, because that's already makes me anxious. That then you've got critical components that might fail. Then, okay, so we've got these massive production sources, but limited number of them.
Yeah.
And how does that end up?
And so, generally through international markets. So these are crops that are grown. They are either grown domestically and consumed domestically, or they're imported from overseas on international markets. And you have a very complicated picture where it's not just the costs of the production of that food, but it's also how governments have subsidized them, the prices that distributors and retailers pay. So it's an incredibly complicated system. I mean, I came from the world of energy, and energy is already pretty complicated. But by the time you get to food, you're like, wow, you're talking about, across Europe, you've got, 5 or 6 million farmers, you've got 300 million people. It's a very complex picture, and that's all interacting between markets. And so, when you look at a particular product, that being on the shelves is a function of all these other.
And I suppose it also intersects with the energy market too, isn't it? Because you can't grow food and ship it, process it, package it, and deliver it without an energy system.
Mm-hmm.
And as we discovered in the heat waves a few years ago, when across Europe, not only did we end up with a 20% reduction in production of all form of crops, but the Rhine was running at 34 centimeters. You couldn't get barges through easily. The energy production from solar, as the panels got too hot, but of cooling nuclear reactors had to get switched off on the hydroelectric in Bow River. Yeah. So the energy system that presumably harvests, ships, transports, process, that too will affect prices.
Well, we actually saw that. We mentioned the sort of 2007, 2008 food price crisis. And some of that was to do with increasing costs of energy as well.
Was that right?
And it was also to do with biofuel expansion. So you were directing more and more of those crops into biofuels, and then pushing up the prices of the crops for feed. Now, in all of these cases, it's never the silver bullet of one factor. Just like you were mentioning with climate change in Syria, there's always these other factors that sort of come together in this perfect storm. What climate does is it constantly adds on the extra layer of pressure.
So let's talk me through this then. One other question first, though, because it's something I hear a lot, and I think it's worth dispelling. That people are saying, well, in the 1960s, maybe 40% of your salary would go on food, and now it's a very small proportion of that. And therefore, there's loads of bandwidth for food prices to go up. But that's not true, is it? Because the pie that we've got, a lot more of the pie is going on things like rents or mortgages or other costs. So presumably, I'd just like to nail that one.
Yeah.
How much bandwidth have we got before people fall into food poverty, even in Western nations?
We're spending sort of 10 to 15%, depends on the nation, on food each year. But yeah, you're quite right. That bandwidth is very, very small. It's a sliver. And we live in an economic system that actually sort of is somewhat designed that way in order that, whatever free discretionary money that you have, it gets sucked up into the sort of the essentials at the moment in terms of housing, for example, that you just mentioned. So actually, that bandwidth is very limited for many people. And I think that's the thing that's difficult to maybe understand and grasp if you're, not struggling quite as much as large areas of the population.
Right. I suppose I'm just thinking back, of course, we have had this issue, haven't we, even in the last 2 years, at people in food banks. Nurses in
you have the Nikkei. You also have this dynamic in the UK, even, it's sort of a rich, ostensibly prosperous country. But, you've got a situation where we saw the cost of living crisis. Yeah. And we saw strikes, and we saw people no longer being able to make ends meet. And the food prices were part of that.
Okay, well, let's come to that then. So let's think of, I suppose let's approach this in two ways. The first is the slow ramping pressure that climate change will bring as a systemic rising amount of pressure. And then the shocks or extreme weather events, like drought, storm, heat waves. What are the systemic pressures as we see now today? It's an autumn day. We're recording this in September of 2025, and we're already seeing the leaves falling off the trees. The blackberries are gone in the countryside. Autumn's arrived early. And what are those systemic changes over the slow burn changes over time leading to food production?
Yeah. So I think what you'll see is these particular interruptions to particular food products. And so, you might get a spike in prices of different products. We have seen that in various products that you just mentioned. I mean, olive oil is another classic one that's struggling quite a lot. And coffees and cocoa, you see these spikes coming up because of climate, but also related to diseases and other factors.
And so the diseases, that's the changing climate, not just in the case of cocoa and coffee and others, affect olive oil, affecting where you can grow the crop and how much you can grow and what the yield is, but it's also about animal pests and plant pests, I guess.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that when you hear somebody talk about some modeling about food futures and how expensive things could get or what kind of impacts there are, it's always worthwhile remembering that with these quantitative assessments, like I said, the 1 to 3% extra food price inflation, it doesn't take into account things like food pests, like salination of the soils, like destruction of infrastructure. Say, a lot of our ports are exposed to sea level rise, for example. And so all of these other sort of cascading factors are not taken into account.
That's worrying then. So, the systemic risk, I'm trying to map in my head now, we've got sort of constant changes in climate, which means you can't grow stuff where you could. You've got pests for animals and plants that make that difficult. You've got, from my world of physiology, difficulty in external work because 75% of the physical work you do comes out as heat. And if it's already hot, there's a limit to what you can do to farm your ground. We've got sea level rise, salt coming in. We've got soil desiccation. As you till the crop, you lose 1% of the soil as it gets blown away and so forth. So we've got all of that issue, and the heat waves creating cooking moisture out the soil. So there's a background pressure. What about the shocks then? What happens when we get a heat wave? The northern jet stream splits as we had a few years ago, and you get this ring of fire around the world. So this massive heat wave in everywhere from China to North America across Europe.
And this is where the global food system gets maybe really complicated. So. Interestingly, what we've seen is a situation where, the US is at its lowest beef herd, in a very, very long time. And that's largely to do with the pressures on the beef herd at the moment. So there's both disease with some of the bird flu issues that we saw in the US, but also climate and drought. And so what do you see in those sorts of situations? Well, you see other countries stepping in with their exports. And so you get this export from Australia to the US, for example, right? So you see food going from wherever people have it to wherever people can pay for it. So that's essentially what happens is food will go to wherever people can pay for it. It's the same thing with natural gas, of course. When we saw the Ukraine crisis, the Russia-Ukraine war, and we saw the crisis in natural gas, and the EU said, we're not going to import any Russian natural gas anymore. I shouldn't say natural gas, of course. I should say methane or dirty gas or bottled gas. But they then had to import liquefied natural gas. And by importing that liquefied natural gas, drew that gas away from Pakistan, from India. And you actually saw energy poverty increasing in those countries because the Europe, with its more purchasing power, was able to purchase that gas away from those countries.
So we're going to see, let's suppose we get that heat wave and we've, we say, knackered the power production, the transport and the crop production. That limits the amount of food available. And I can see that will put price up because that's the standard thing, isn't it? Supply and demand. But explain to me bits that I don't understand. So the Kazakh grain crop collapse and a heat wave was climate related in 2010, and Kazakhstan became a net importer of grain. Wheat prices went up threefold, but rice prices went up 400%, and rice wasn't even affected. Why did I have to pay, or some people who didn't get it buffered, Why do they have to pay 4 times as much for rice?
Well, you see some spillover effects. So first of all, if the price of one crop goes up like that, you might see switching of diets between those different grains. So if you see the products going up, say in wheat, and yet your rice products are at still at a lower price, they will get rise too. Potentially the worst problem there is speculation, and that's where you get a lot of volatility in these grain markets. We get people speculating on the prices increasing.
And how does that work then? Because I'm a numpty here in terms of speculation. Is that people withholding supply of a commodity that they now think would have greater value if they limited the supply? So restrict the flow of rice. People are really after it and it pushes the price up. Or how does a speculation otherwise work to drive the price up?
I mean, it can work like that. And as I understand, I'm not a finance expert, but as I understand it, through the finance market, you can buy options on future production and future prices. And then you can start to sort of then look at how you think those crops will go in the future. And by playing in those derivative markets, my understanding is that you can make margins ongoing.
So thinking forwards then, we're already seeing impacts. Now, my knowledge of this just comes from reading the scientific journals and the newspapers, but I'm understanding that the British farming sector has been badly hit by a combination of droughts and lack of rainfall even in winter, but also flooding and heat waves in combination. Can you confirm that? I'm hearing that we've had big hits on winter and summer barley, for instance, as well as wheat.
Yeah, I mean, it's the second really bad year. There's two major drivers. It seems there's the climate factor, which is the biggest driver as far as I can see. The second driver is we are getting slightly lower arable production as well in the country, and this is in part being taken out, in part because due to new subsidy schemes. And this highlights a real issue that I'm very concerned about moving forwards. Is we have these new subsidy schemes in the UK. So we moved away from the EU subsidy schemes. And now we're moving towards schemes that will help the environment, which is fantastic. That's absolutely what we need to be doing. The problem is that when you do that, most of the things that are going to help the environment is going to be giving some land back to nature. Now, if you give some land back to nature, your arable land is going to reduce. Okay, it's a smaller factor than the climate, but I'll get back onto that in a moment. And you're going to sort of have a reduction in yields, for example. Now, if you continue to do that, then you will just be importing more, because to be able to meet the same demand as you had before with a lower amount of land, is if you're not like producing more from the land, which we're not because of climate change and other factors, then you're going to import that land even more. Now, the importation of that food is likely going to become from tropical areas, which is going to be a disaster for biodiversity and disaster for climate and shit. So what I often talk about, and I know you talk about a lot on the podcast, is the need for plant-rich diets, because we cannot do this transition more nature on our land without this dietary change. I mean, in the UK, for example, if we were to eat a diet that's good for health, good for nature, planetary health diets, we would save an area almost the size of Scotland. And then our system becomes much, much smaller.
And can we do this? So let me put up the straw dolls or the arguments that are often used against it, which is say the area that we're using to graze cows and sheep, you can't grow crops on anyway. I'd appreciate that some of that's true. If you look at North Devon, a lot of it's very steep and you probably could only graze something on it. But is there a lot of land that could be turned over from animal use to growing?
Yeah. So you've got two factors there. The first one is that some of that land is perfectly possible to grow crops on. It's probably a minority, but it's a significant minority, probably around 20-30%, maybe even a bit more. You could grow crops on those steep areas. It's just going to cost you more money to do it. I mean, that essentially in food systems is you're always up against the economics of it. So yeah, you could do all sorts of things on steep land if you want to. I mean, just look at different societies around the world when you put in terraces, for example. But, fundamentally, there's still a fair amount of grazing there. The other part of this is the feed. Now, we use about 40% of our arable land for animal feed. So we don't actually need any more land to be growing any more plant products for us in this transition. What we need to use is a very small proportion of that 40% we're already growing as feed for animals.
And yes, and given that 38% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food supply chain, 22% of global heating from methane, lots of which is belching cows, and so forth, it does make sense. And as the medically doctory part, as you rightly point out, plant-based diets are profoundly good for health. They lower risk of everything from Alzheimer's and lung disease through to cancer and dementia and obesity and kidney disease and high blood pressure and strokes and heart attacks. This is something that we could all do, even if we didn't have a concern about climate change. That as a doctor, it's something I would very strongly advocate to people.
Yeah. Just a note on the emissions. Food's an interesting one in what you include in those emissions.
Right.
So the scientific research on this suggests that the food system is anywhere between 25 and 33% of the emissions, depending on what boundary you use. But on the plant-rich diets, there's so many reasons for us to do it. And we're talking about climate change, but biodiversity. I mean, if you look at, there's this concept called the planetary boundaries.
Yes.
Yeah. And the
explain all this.
So the planetary boundaries is this idea that we want to limit the environmental pressures in numerous different areas. Otherwise, we head over a tipping point and we change those systems for good. They're irreversible changes. And so if you look at the planetary boundaries, you can look across these different areas and these different planetary and environmental impacts. And you can say, where are we at with these different environmental pressures? And if you look at all of them in the round, agriculture is either the first or the second biggest. So it's the second biggest driver of climate change, but it might be the first as we continue to do the energy transition. But it's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, the biggest driver of habitat loss. It's the biggest driver of nutrient pollution that will actually kill life in water, in aquatic environments. It's the biggest one of the biggest drivers of air pollution in high-income countries. Yeah. Now, as we've cleaned up from removing those coal power stations, agriculture is now becoming the largest driver of air pollution in the in the UK and in the EU, for example. And so, even if it wasn't for the climate reasons we would want to be doing it, but we want to do it for the climate reasons too. And I think the other thing to draw in here on this plant-rich diets part, and especially on the land part, is governments in the UK, in the EU, across the world, are looking to use land to draw down carbon onto that land, to use it as a nature-based solution to draw down carbon. And if we really want to do that, we're going to need land to do that on. Right. They also want to use that land for timber buildings because timber's better than concrete. They want to use it for bioplastics because bioplastics could be better than petroleum plastics. They want to use it for sustainable aviation fuel, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer to put sustainable in front of that when it uses so much land and it now raises so much land. They want to use it for biodiversity protection, all these sorts of things. So my main message to a lot of people is if you abhor any of these things, if you're an architect that works with timber buildings, if you're in aviation and you want sustainable aviation fuel, I mean, I don't think this is going to work out, but if you do want that, you need to be pro plant-rich diets. So if you go across all these different sectors, you need to always be talking about diets because it's the only way we're going to get there with a land.
And it's a good point you make, actually, because today, the day we're recording this, a paper came out in Nature, which you may not have even seen because it was only this morning, looking at the area of land available for planting trees if we thought the planting trees was the way to deal with our emissions. And the point it makes is that we've got it badly wrong in overestimating it. Because if you take out places that have already got trees on them, or places that you can't plant trees because they're too steep, hot, cold, dry, whatever, and only look at the places that you are yet fit for trees being planted. If you planted trees on all of them, right now, the most you could draw down is 40 gigatons of CO2, which is less than 1 year's worth of emissions.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that you're right, that if we can, the big win here is to move to plant-based. And again, this isn't a political broadcast in that sense. So I'm not here to say everyone must be vegan or you should never eat.
No. Yeah.
Because plant-rich, can you explain what we mean by plant-rich?
Yeah, I mean, this is the main thing about we're not telling people it's more, if you want this, then this is what would have to happen. That's all you're saying on a sort of very physical basis. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. But look, this is the future that you're looking at. It's not really telling people to consume one thing or another. In terms of this diet, the diet that we normally model isn't actually a fully plant-rich diet or, vegan diet. It's actually not even a vegetarian diet. So the one that I suggested earlier, where we save an area almost the size of Scotland, and still has dairy, it still has eggs, it still has meat. It just has much less. So when we're looking at this diet, it's about a burger once every 2 weeks, and that's 2 weeks, and that's the biggest reduction.
Right.
Whereas, there's still some dairy, there's still cheese, there's still butter, there's still...
Yeah, because the point, isn't it? Eat mainly vegetables, and if you're going to have meat, have it less frequently.
Yeah.
And when you're having the meat, have a little less of it.
Yeah.
And if you can make it, ideally chicken or pork, something to indulge meat.
Yeah. And it's worth stating that, the more you go, the better it gets.
Right.
So, the diets that we look at in terms of the healthy diets, a very famous diet called the Lancet diet. And it has this range for different intakes of different foods, and that goes right down to zero. So you can model a completely plant-based diet. You can even model an increased meat diet compared to that. But even on the high end, that's still a reduction from where we are today.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I went to a plant-based diet. I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan, but I'm plant-based. And I did that probably 20 odd years ago because of climate.
Yeah.
And you'd have thought as a doctor, I might have worked out first that by doing that, my risk of bowel cancer, a bunch of other cancers, of dementia, obesity, kidney, and all these things was less. But I only realized that when I made the move. So there are multiple reasons for doing this.
Yeah, the evidence on that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
It's really as solid as you can get. I mean, going into this as an environmental scientist and reading some of that literature, and I didn't know where things... And I'd somewhat bought drunk the Kool-Aid, if you like, of a whole bunch of people and influencers, all sorts of people telling me that, we don't know much about nutrition. It's all a bit of this. Surely it's just everything in moderation. And I looked at the research about sort of like 10 years ago. It's obvious.
Yeah, it's
really obvious. And the interesting thing is when you actually look at... There was an interesting study that came out the other day that looked at studies that had industry backing and studies that didn't have industry backing. And for example, they found that, unprocessed red meat in the non-industry funded studies was far worse for you than the ones in the industry funded studies.
Yeah. I think we're beginning to, I'm looking at the clock here. Good. So yes, we're about 30 minutes in. So I would like to, as we always do, sum up briefly what I've heard, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I've heard that the food system that supplies us is fragile because it's dependent on a very complex international web that's also dependent on other complex webs like energy, that the bandwidth for us feeding ourselves, whether you're poor living in rural Africa or even in Britain in a wealthier state, is narrow because even small increases in food price can mean that large sections of society can't feed themselves, and that when that happens, you get civil unrest and political distress and dysfunction, and that we've got ramping pressures on food prices from systemic changes like plant pests and animals and the inability to grow crops, etc. But also these shock events that drive prices up, availability down, and prices up again by speculation. And that the best answer we can come up to that, it would be to, for the best that we can, to move to a plant-based diet, which isn't to say you will never ever touch a burger again. You made that point. Let me ask you then, including that sort of thing and anything else, question we always ask our guests, across the whole suite of life, what are our listeners going to do now when they finish listening this to address the risk of climate change? Because you mentioned at the start of this podcast that we're already seeing the impacts and they're going to be very grave and very... So what is it that we should all do when we click off from this podcast today?
Yeah, I think there are the personal things that we can do, and then there's the systemic things that we can do. So the personal things you can do, and I think this is very similar to your 7 suggestions, but the personal things we can do is go plant rich, and that is so big for not just climate change, but there's so much else. The other thing that, just to add on to your summary there, what you were mentioning is, I think also plant-rich diets will be much more resilient to climate change.
Okay.
Because as you move towards these plant-rich diets, you make this system smaller, you save more land. And as the yields come down because of climate change, you've got more distributed land which you could grow over. You've saved a whole bunch of land that you could actually then continue to grow in as the yields come down.
I suppose it's also easier to store grain than it is to store meat, right?
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, no, that's a very big point. And also the pressures on animals is also heat risk. And so there was one study that came out that found that, with future warming, you'd see dairy production go down 10% across the world. I mean, that was a global one, just because the animals are more stressed because they're hotter, because we're stressed. Okay, so anyway, back to it. So we've got the plant-rich diets. electrify your life in any which way possible,
Yeah.
because solar and wind is wonderful. And that doesn't necessarily mean electric cars. It can mean any electric vehicles. Electric bikes is the big one.
Yeah.
We completely overlook.
Or your pedal bike without electric at all.
Yeah, or no electric
If you're healthy enough. But the great thing is that electric bikes are good for people who are ill or poorly or have disabilities of any sort.
Yeah, and even for carrying stuff around.
Yeah.
I mean, even you could imagine it even for tradies for people around London, for example. I mean, it's totally possible to do that.
Right.
Then switching your bank, that's obviously a really, really big one, and staying grounded as much as possible. So flying is incredibly unequal activity, but all of this doesn't mean very much if you don't talk about it. So I think that talking about this to people, it's actually social contagion. That actually the way in which we copy one another is a very social species, which actually these things matter.
It's a very good point. And actually, we mentioned this before, but this is the first podcast people listening to this. If you remember our numbers from COVID, so I infect 3, that's 4 of us have got ill, and 3 infects you, that's 9, plus the 4, that's 13. And the numbers go up exponentially. And if the advertisers are right, there's each one of us has 7 people that love us or respect us enough. They say, well, I love Paul that much, or I respect Paul that much, I'll do what he says. That's 7 that you change, that's plus you, that's 8. The 7 change 7, that's 49, plus your 8. On the 12th cycle, we'll ask you, we can't do that in your head, any idea, but the 12th time you've done that cycle of 7 infections, how many people have changed?
Go ahead.
It's nearly 13 billion.
Yeah.
So it's essentially nearly twice the number of people there are on the planet.
Right.
And all we've got to do is start this brush fire you're talking about. We take the action to demonstrate to others that we're doing the right thing. We encourage them to join the gang.
Yeah.
And then we get others because we're social animals.
And I think just an important step on that. One of the reasons why I don't think we like to talk about it is because we think we're alone, or that we might come across as judgy, or there might be some sort of tension by mentioning this. And what the research shows over and over again is we underestimate one another. And so we can actually have more confidence in these talking. Like, so for example, in the US, they asked about 6,000 people, what do you think the support is for a carbon tax in this country? The tax, the dirty word in the US. What do you think they said?
Well, they're probably going to come in at saying, it's 10%.
Yeah, this is it. So they came in and they said, it's about 30%, they said. And then they asked all of them, they said, do you support a carbon tax? And it turned out that the support was double. It was 62% of people supported a carbon tax. And then actually, if you split that up between Republicans and Democrats and all the different sort of demographics, it was the same. It might have been lower with the Republicans overall, but there was still a double among the Republican support. And the interesting thing is, this has been now replicated on a global level. And it's also been replicated in studies where they've told people about this and then asked them, does it change your habits or what you would do? Or they've investigated that in a sort of randomized controlled trial way. And what they find is, if you realize this, you're willing to do more as well. I think this is really important for when people want to sort of have these conversations, to know they're in a safe space.
Okay, so the final thing I would put into this then is the politics, because you raised an interesting point. So if we look at Reform at the moment, whose leader has said he doesn't think he wants to do anything on climate change, which is something I would disagree with. But it turns out that 72% of people who say they would support Reform actually wish to see greater action on climate change. So even amongst that constituency, the number of people who think we should be taking action is much more.
Yeah.
Paul, it's been an enormous pleasure to have you on. I may ask you back because, of course, Lancet EAT 2.0, the new report, comes out in October. And it'd be very interesting to know what it says. I've got no insight on that yet. I'd love to know what it's going to say, but I might perhaps ask you for some comments.
I'd be delighted to. Yeah. Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much for
it.
Thank you.
The Real Zero podcast with Hugh Montgomery and Daniel Grant. Produced by me, Daniel Grant, aka The Stealth Doctor, on YouTube and Instagram. Find out more about Real Zero by heading to realzero.earth and find out more about how you and your friends can start making a real difference today.